Okay, Assalamu alaikum everyone. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Welcome to another amazing Saturday session where we're going to be covering Surah 60, Al-Mumtahana. This is our 85th Surah, so this is very exciting. I think we only have 3 more that we haven't covered either way in Project Illumine or in the line-by-line traditional version. I, of course, first have to start by calling out the incredible khutbah from yesterday. It's called The Word of Power in a World of Disempowerment. And it's starts out with a really beautiful discussion of the word Allah. And Sheikh was saying he's a real believer in using the dhikr, just the word Allah, without anything else, and explained that it comes from the word wallah. I'm not an Arabic speaker, so I'm just conveying what he told us after the fact, which means that it's what you crave for. It's something primordial within you, and so the idea that he suggests in the khutbah that even if you just try the experiment of saying Allah over and over again for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, for an hour, whatever you can handle, and that see what that does, and that it just calls to that primordial place, but it was a really powerful start of a khutbah that really articulated I think a lot of what we feel, especially in the world today. You read the news, you look at what's happening with whether it's Muslims around the world, climate change, politics, war, any of that, and you can very easily get frustrated and anxious and overwhelmed by your own helplessness in a world where it's really designed by people who, other people, you receive a world, it's almost like you're in a matrix and you are in this world of disempowerment. And if you choose to go it alone, you are very quickly overwhelmed by your own amount of helplessness. And the alternative is to, reach for Allah, for God, for, the source of all power. And it just, begins, it's transformative. And, as Sheikh was saying, it's for people who haven't had that experience. It's like night and day. Either you go it alone and you're on your own, or you have the power of God with you. And it comes from building that relationship, and it can start with just starting with that very powerful dhikr. So it was a really beautiful khutbah. And then also in the second khutbah, he discussed what's been happening with Professor Nader Hashemi, our dear friend, and who's also on our board, and how he came under attack because as he was talking about the assassination attempt on Salman Rushdie, he just named several different possibilities of who could have been behind it. As as a way of conveying, we really have no idea what the reason was that this man chose to go after Salman Rushdie. And one of the things that he mentioned was that it could have been someone who was part of Mossad, but part of the Israeli intelligence, and that unleashed a firestorm against him. And it's a horrible ongoing situation. But among the other things he named were Islamophobia. He could be a terrorist. He could be part of the Iranian terrorist group. He mentioned other things. No one seemed to care about any of those other things. But once the name Israel is mentioned, all hell breaks loose. And how that's just another sign of this world that we live in. And where does someone like Nader Hashemi find power? Alhamdulillah, he can find it in, again, circling back to the idea of Allah and having the power of God with you, especially when you're speaking truth, to power and speaking on behalf of justice. So anyway, it was a really, really beautiful khutbah with so much more than what I said, so I really encourage people to watch that. I just wanted to share this one article that someone sent to me this week that I thought was very interesting, and I shared it with a couple of people here, and I said it really made me especially appreciate what we're doing here, in the Project Illumine Tafsir, going through the Qur'an. It's an article in the New York Times. It's called, in the section called By the Book, the novel that made Karen Armstrong quit her reading group. So it's an interview with Karen Armstrong, and we know, as Muslims, Karen Armstrong is an author who has been very sympathetic towards Muslims. People love her. Muslims love her. She's written a book, I think, several books, about the Prophet, about Islam, about a number of things. She used to be a nun, so she's, a very religious figure and a religious scholar. And so it was an interview with her with a lot of different interesting questions, but the one that really struck me is the question, do you think any canonical books are widely misunderstood? And the way she answered that is, people often tell me that they have read the Quran from cover to cover and found it boring, dogmatic, and repetitive. But the Quran was not originally meant to be read, and like any great poetry, certainly not in translation. The word Quran means recitation. It makes sense only when you listen to it chanted by a skilled reciter. It is indeed repetitive, but in rather the same way as variations in a piece of music, which subtly amplify the original melody, adding layer upon layer of complexity. These recurrent themes and images, together with the emotive chant, help people to slow down their mental processes and enter a different mode of consciousness. The effect is visceral. Quote, a chill creeps over the skins of those who fear their Lord, and their skins and hearts soften at the remembrance of God. So she cites the Quranic verse 39:23. The American scholar Michael Sells describes what happens on a hot, crowded bus in Alexandria when someone plays a cassette of Quranic recitations. Quote, a meditative calm begins to set in. People relax. The jockeying for space ends. The voices of those who are talking grow quieter and less strained. Others are silent, lost in thought. A sense of shared community overtakes the discomfort. And that's from the book Approaching the Quran. And she closes by saying, I don't think this would happen if a London bus driver played a cassette of Bible readings during the rush hour. So, that's obviously, one take and one, real effect of the Quran. But, this is a scholar of religion and who's written, as someone that, as I said, Muslims really revere for what she has said about Islam. But this is not how, from everything we've learned here, I would ever describe the Quran at the start, to say, like, has a canonical book been widely misunderstood? I mean, we have this incredible gift of having learned that the Quran is not boring, dogmatic, and repetitive, obviously, but that it is meant to be read and understood. It's not just great poetry. There's, there are messages, there's a very deep meaning. I mean, people who've been following us, I don't need to tell you how special and wonderful this is. But at some levels, it just makes me really sad that, someone who is so learned in religion doesn't even really know what the potential is that we've uncovered in this, in these halakas with the Quran. And she spent her entire lifetime studying religion. So, we are it just underscores for me again, I mean, how blessed we are, how much we've learned, how much, like, everything that we've covered in the Quran has been life transforming for us, and our challenge is just to convey it to others, that there's something here that is worth studying. There's something that can change your life. There's something here that can really reconnect you to God and God's message and God's purpose. This is the elevated path to the divine, and it's clear. But it wouldn't have been accessible to us without, obviously, the work of Sheikh. But again, we know so much more, and look how far we've come from what one religious scholar, a highly esteemed scholar, has to say about our book. So, alhamdulillah, obviously with this great gift comes great accountability and responsibility, and may Allah help us to internalize the lessons for ourselves, but also to help others find their way to this really transformative education. So anyway, I just wanted to share that because someone sent it to me, and I had a reaction to it, and alhamdulillah, all I can say is alhamdulillah. So for what that's worth. Anyway, I'm so excited to engage with another surah, alhamdulillah, and thank you for joining us. May Allah help us learn and internalize what we need to do. Thank you. Sheikh.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم سبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على حبيب المصطفى محمد المرسل رحمة للعالمين خاتم الرسل والأنبياء أجمعين وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين وعلى أصحابه المختارين وعلى من اتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين اللهم يا علي عظيم اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي يا رب العالمين. Inshallah, today we talk about Surah al-Mumtahana, الممتحنة. Um, الممتحنة is short surah, a later revelation. So at the outstart, um, like the reports we've talked about before about the chronology of the surah, you read uh, a number of interesting reports that Al-Mumtahana was revealed after Al-Ahzab. And some even say that it was revealed after Al-Ahzab and before Al-Nisa. And that there, that's just impossible. That chronology is quite impossible. It most certainly was revealed after Al-Ahzab, but not right after Al-Ahzab. And it most certainly was not revealed before An-Nisa. And indeed, Surah Al-Mumtahina, in all likelihood, was revealed after Surah Al-Hajj and Surah Al-Fath. And as late as the 7th Hijri year, and even perhaps the beginning of the 8th Hijri year. Now, Al-Mumtahina is another one of these Medina surah that revolves around a historical set of events. Something that happens that the surah responds to. And so we can understand the context of the surah because of that historical event or the historical events that unfold. So as we've talked about that when we discussed Al-Hajj and Al-Fath, after the attempt to go on pilgrimage and Quraysh turning away Muslims that year, and Muslims then entering the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, the treaty where they decide on peace terms for 10 years. The Quraysh ended up violating the treaty 3 years or so into the treaty, so we didn't get to the entire 10 years. But as you recall, part of the terms of the treaty, terms which at the time the majority of Muslims did not understand why the Prophet ﷺ would agree to these terms, which included a certain lack of reciprocity, and that is if people from Mecca convert and try to join Medina, that Muslims are obligated not to accept them and must turn them away. While if people left Medina, apostated, and went back and wanted to go back to Mecca, they would be allowed to do so. There are no barriers to that. And as I'm sure you remember that because it's of this unequal term, at the time, if not a substantial, it probably was a majority of the companions were quite offended about these terms. Now, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah itself did not say anything about what would happen if the converts were women, one way or the other. Um, was it intended to cover women? Although you'll find in Islamic sources a substantial disagreement about this. Some said no, that it was not intended, that by the terms of the treaty, it only really, uh, the negotiators were only really thinking of men. Um, so you within Islamic sources, you'll find a substantial disagreement as to whether the treaty was actually intended to cover women or not. The As we will see, the difficulty, however, arose that when Muslims were confronted with women who converted to Islam and um, left Mecca and attempted to join Muslims in Medina, it was for many different reasons. It was emotionally extremely difficult to accept the idea that these women should be returned to Mecca, where it was most certain that if they continued to adhere to their beliefs, they would be persecuted and harmed and even possibly killed. Um, Meccan society, I mean, remember from a while ago Omar's testimony that Meccan society, men controlled women, and in Medinian society, according to this report, that it was women who controlled men. Meccan society was a patriarchal society par excellence. It was a society in which, for a woman to play a prominent public role or to be allowed her own terms, she would have needed to be from a fairly powerful, fairly aristocratic family. I mean, it was, when we see it, it was always with women that come from very prominent families, like Hind, for instance, Abu Sufyan's wife. But other than these few exceptions, the 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 act of a woman dissenting from the will of her family, the will of her husband, the will of her parents, would have had grave consequences for these women. So there's this issue that Muslims found it very, even dishonorable, to turn away these women and to say, no, you go back to Mecca. And as we will see, though, there is, like always in history, the history is infinitely more complex than what narrations tell us. Um, and we have to exert an added effort to try to get to the nuances and layers of history, um, because life itself is complex, and we'll talk about the full setting, inshallah. Okay. So the context is, and the title of the very title given to the surah, Al Mumtahana, which literally translates into the tested woman, refers to the process of vetting through which Muslims would then decide who would be allowed to remain in Medina and who would be turned back. Okay. But there is a side to this that is rather very interesting. Medina, after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and I am fairly sure, 90% sure, that Mumtahana was revealed after the Battle of Khaybar. And Medina starts becoming a place of considerable fame and reputation in Arabia. It is no longer the doldrums. It is no longer the place that has been plagued by a civil war that is very likely that Mecca is going to quash and destroy. During these 7 years, Medina has proved itself. Medina has set its mark on all of Arabia. And we know this how? We know this because we see after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, the number of conversions exceeds anything. More people convert right after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, in the year after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, than in the entire 7 years after the Hijrah. And not only that, but neutral tribes are sending, as we will see in reference to a particular ayah, neutral tribes are sending to the Prophet ﷺ and taking the initiative to say, don't count us as allies of Mecca. They don't want to be thought of as part of the Mecca folks. We'll come to it. Yeah. Instead of jumping ahead. Okay, we'll come to it. Anyway, so you have, and Mecca itself, people are converting, especially the younger folks, have lost faith in the leadership of Mecca, and they no longer see the inherited beliefs of Mecca as inevitable or rational or logical. There is clearly plenty of evidence that the Qur'an is breaking through. People are hearing what the Qur'an has to say. People are communicating, reciting to each other verses of the Qur'an, and it is making sense, and it is attracting people. And the luster of the institution of idol worship is on the wane. So we see in the first 2 years, in a considerable number of people, a large number of people, that are from Mecca who are in fact converting, and they go to Medina and they turned away, and they don't want to go back to Mecca and be persecuted. Well, actually, they fall into two groups. There are some of them who go back to Mecca and keep their Islam a secret, and we know about their Islam only after the Fath, only after the conquering of Mecca. So there are, these reports of individuals who, after Mecca is conquered, um, we have a riwayah, oh yeah, this person came to Medina and was turned away, but, so they've been a Muslim for a while. So that's one group. The other group are the group that actually becomes even more of a pain in Mecca's side. Those who don't want to keep Islam a secret and don't want to go back to Mecca where they're going to be persecuted. So what did they do? They created their own communities. They would all meet each other, people who've been turned away, and they're men for the most part, because after Surah al-Mumtahana, the women were allowed to join Mecca, and a lot of the men would say to their wives, okay, you go ahead, you settle in the safety of Mecca. I'm going to go with the community of exiles who are male. And they made Mecca's life extremely difficult because Mecca denied them the right to believe in what they believe, the freedom to believe in what they want to believe in. They would made it a business to interrupt Mecca's trade, to raid their caravans, to in a variety of ways just make it. Even some of them would start stopping people who are traveling to Mecca and sort of like tell them, "What is your business in Mecca?" My business is XYZ. Well, if you're an ally of Abu Sufyan, any ally of Abu Sufyan is our enemy. So be on notice, things like that. So all of this is none of this is particularly new. This is all well documented and has been written about, and even Orientalists, at least those who are more fair-minded of them, could not deny what I've just described. But there is an element to this dynamic that unfortunately has not been written about. And that is Mecca becomes attractive not just for those who are sincere converts, but it becomes attractive to many people who are not converts at all. And I think there are two main reasons for this. First reason is that the word gets around that did I say Mecca? I meant Medina, not Mecca. Medina. Medina becomes attractive. The first is that the word gets around that if you are destitute, if you are without means, Medina is where people take care of the poor. These are the people who now Medina has become wealthier after its military successes and has more alliances. So for the first time now, since the 5th Hijri year, Medina's trade, now there's a substantial trade you can speak of. The caravans are not just going to Mecca. Caravans actually head to Medina. And as there is more money, there are also more generous donors. But there's another element that is very interesting, and I'll show you how it pops up. Um, if you're reading the sources carefully, Medina starts looking for a lot of women who are having problems with who uh, are having problems with their in their marriages, with their families. Medina looks like an attractive. Now, the sources don't preserve for us the details, but I'll show you what the sources do tell us. That the idea that women are more empowered in Medina, not in an ideological sense, but in the most clear, mundane sociological sense. There is a certain um, a certain social reputation about the the mobility of human beings, about the dignity of human beings, about the welfare of human beings that is going on in Medina. So, what that means is not everyone that is showing up and wanting to be a part of Medina is actually a convert. So, what some of the most interesting, or part of the most interesting facts about Surah Al Mumtahana is the sources don't start out by saying that the occasion for revelation or the reason for the revelation of the surah was because of women who um, women who converted to Islam. Actually, the sources say that the first cause of revelation for Surah Al-Mumtahana, the first cause was a woman who um, who was not a convert to Islam. Um, her, I can't, I'm blanking out on her name, but no, no. Um, um, the woman, Sarah, her name is Sarah. So this woman goes to Medina, and there are, as always, different versions of exactly the conversation that takes place, but all the versions agree on the gist of it. Is that she is asked, did you come because you're a Muslim? She says no. Did you come because you're a Muhajira? She says no. So why did you come? And she basically says, I came because I am destitute. I am very poor, and I came because I want financial help. And the Prophet ﷺ tells people to help her. So she's not a convert, among the kuffar, but she comes to Medina for financial assistance. And why do we know about this? Why so many reports preserve the memory of this woman? Um, the reason the memory of this woman is preserved is because of the role the unwitting, because of a particular event that takes place. We'll talk about. I'm not sure her name was Sarah now. I, I, no, it is Sarah. It is Sarah. Yeah, it is Sarah. I can't remember her last name, but it is Sarah. Okay. Um, so they give her clothes, they give her food, they give her money. And among the people who helps her, who gives her aid, is um, a man who had a, a man from Mecca who had come to Medina after the Hijrah, and he did a Hijrah, in other words, he's a Muhajir. And his name is Hatib, Hatib ibn Balta. Um, and this man had fought in Badr, in the Battle of Badr, and he gives help to this woman, but he also writes a note that he gives to her and says, "Give this note to the elders of Mecca." And in the note, it warns Mecca that the Prophet is preparing to invade them. This incident then tells us that Surah Al-Mumtahana must have been revealed after Mecca had breached the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which then means that it was 3 years after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. So it's shortly before the Battle of Mecca. Or there wasn't even really a battle, but before the conquering of Mecca. Okay, now Hatib, although he's a Muhajir, and although he fought in the Battle of Badr, and although he is a one of the close companions, he was also in the Battle of Ahzab. He was not among the people who withdrew or ran away, and he was also in the pilgrimage. Who among the people who went to the on the pilgrimage without arms? In other words, the solid 1,500 people that followed the Prophet, and also among the people who gave the bay'ah at Aqaba, to the pledge to fight to the death and so on. So he is a man with a solid history. The issue with Hatib, though, is that when he converted and went on Hijrah, his wife and children refused to convert. And they remained back in Mecca all this time. Hatib himself was not a genuine Meccan. He did not belong to one of the tribes of Quraysh. He was a Mawla, meaning he is, and well, according to some reports, that he is not an authentic Arab. He's an Arabized Arab, but whether that's true or not, anyway. But what's clearly known is that he's not from a prominent tribe. His place in Meccan society before Islam was that he was in a protected status, sort of under the guardianship of an authentic Meccan family. And Hatib is worried about once hostilities, or once Mecca realizes that that he doesn't know at this point whether Mecca is going to put up a fight, whether there's going to be a siege of Mecca, whether I think he couldn't have imagined that what in fact did happen would have happened. What did happen is that Mecca folded very easily. Once they saw the Islamic armies, or the armies from Medina, it turned out, as I said before, and I'm completely convinced of this, that Mecca had become substantially Muslim. Because otherwise, the fact that the elders didn't even put up any resistance. Muslims didn't need to lay siege to Mecca. There were only very minor skirmishes that took place. That is impossible. If you know anything about Meccan history and the history of Quraysh and the Moors of Quraysh, for that to happen, Quraysh must have realized there is no point to fighting anymore. They're just simply, they had already lost the battle before it started. So, but Hatib, of course, didn't know that, and there was no way for him to know that. And what Hatib was worried about is that Mecca would retaliate. Mecca's not going to retaliate against prominent families or the wives and children of converts from prominent families, but people like him who are Mawali. Mecca could indeed then either imprison or simply execute his family, sort of as a way of retaliating against these Muslims. So he sends this note warning Mecca, and the woman who's not a Muslim takes the note and she is on her way back to Mecca when the Prophet receives a warning from the angel, from Gabriel, that there's a woman carrying this note. So he sends Imam Ali and Zubair and Al-Miqdad, and he tells them, go in, what is the word I'm looking for? Stop this woman and retrieve the note from her. And they indeed go and they tell her, they stop her and she denies she's carrying a note, and they say, if you don't produce the note, we will search you. So she was hiding the note in the locks of her hair, and she gives him the note. So the Prophet ﷺ goes back to Hatib and says, why did you do this? And he says what I just told you, is that I am a mawla. I'm from the fringes of Qurayshi society, and my wife and my children are back there, and I feared the retaliation against my family when Mecca realizes that Muslim armies are heading to them. And the Prophet ﷺ says, forgives him and doesn't punish him, and just tells him to repent. And interestingly, the reports tell us that this was the initial reason for the revelation of Surah Al-Mumtahana. And that is why the very first verse of Surah Al-Mumtahana, يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تتخذوا عدوي وعدوكم أولياء تلقون إليهم بالمودة وقد كفروا بما جاءكم من الحق يخرجون الرسول وإياكم أن تؤمنوا بالله ربكم إن كنتم خرجتم جهادا في سبيلي وابتغاء مرضاتي تسرون إليهم بالمودة وأنا أعلم بما أخفيتم وما أعلنتم ومن يفعله منكم فقد ضل سواء السبيل. So the very first verse, which talks about, well, let's read the translation first. Believers, do not take my enemies, who are your enemies as well, as friends, showing them affection, even though they are bent on denying whatever truth has come unto you, and even though they have driven the apostle and yourselves away, only because you believe in God, your sustainer. If it be true that you have gone forth from your home to strive in my cause, and out of a longing for my goodly acceptance, do not take them for your friends, inclining towards them in secret affection. For I am fully aware of all that you may conceal, as well as of all that you do openly. And any of you who does this has already strayed from the right path. And so the sources tell us that the occasion for the opening revelation in Surah Mumtahana is this incident was Hatib. Um, and in this sense, when Surah Al-Mumtahana talks about tulquna ilayhim bil mawadda, it is not talking about being a friend. But although there is a verse later on that comes closer to the issue of friendship, but it is, if these reports are accurate, then it is referring to divided loyalties, acting upon a divided sense of loyalty, as Hatib did. But why does Allah choose the word mawadda if what Allah is talking about is an act of treason? What Hatib did is what we today would call treason. And although the Prophet ﷺ forgave him and didn't punish him, nevertheless, in military affairs, if you betray a secret like that, it seems incongruous to use the word mawadda, which is much broader than treason. So why does God use that expression? And in my view, because the rest of the surah I think makes that clear, is that if you look at the heart of what Hatib did, Hatib tells the Prophet ﷺ that, which is actually really interesting, because I had sort of like forgot about this for a second. He tells him that, one, I did not apostate. I am not loyal to them, but tells him that, and also tells him, I did not believe, and I do not believe that my warning them would have helped them militarily. The only thing is that I hoped by warning them, I will carry favor with them so they won't hurt my family. So he explicitly tells the Prophet ﷺ this. And he's probably right. I mean, it seemed like people knew that the balance of powers have tipped. Maybe people didn't expect Mecca to fold as easily as they did, but the way that Muslims organized and marched into Mecca, it was clear that they already knew that the balance of power has drastically changed in the past 3 years since the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. So what is it that what is the heart of Hatib's fault? The heart of Hatib's fault is he put his personal affairs, his personal gain, ahead of the collective well-being. And I'll show you this as we go about that. These are people who are hostile they, even if they might give you reprieve, Allah specifies that these are people who, A, they've they've threw you out of your homeland, they've banished you or caused you to leave your homeland because of your beliefs. But then Allah further specifies, إن يثقفوكم يكونوا لكم أعداء ويبسطوا إليكم أيديهم وألسنتهم بالسوء ودوا لو تكفرون. In truth, these are also people that, as it said, if they could overcome you, if they had the opportunity to in fact overcome you, they would not treat you with kindness or friendliness. They would treat you as enemies. And they would make it a point, if you remain Muslims, to harm you, both physically with their hands and with their tongues. And the heart of the matter is that they have a problem with your religion. وَدُّوا لَوْ تَكْفُرُونَ. That what they're not only would they harm you with their hands and tongues with evil intent, as the translation says, but they desire that you should deny, you should abandon your faith. They are not at peace with the fact that you believe what you believe. Okay. And this is why Allah then follows this by saying, لن تنفعكم أولادكم, right? يوم القيامة يفصل بينكم والله بما تعملون بصير. If you are giving priority to your family or to your money, in other words, to your personal affairs, well, it will avail you nothing in the hereafter. Because Allah knows that you've put personal interest ahead of the common good in dealing with a people who are not just has transgressed against you. So not just is there a historical transgression, but a continuing state of enmity on part of these people that we're talking about. They hate the fact that you're Muslims. And if they had the opportunity, they would malign you, slander you, attack your faith. Okay. So this setting is quite important, as we will see that Medina, after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, by the way, this woman, which is actually, I should have mentioned that, but anyway. This woman, Sarah, the woman that carried the message, her job in Mecca was a singer. She, so I mean, for all these Muslims who don't understand the humanity of Islam, I mean, this is a woman who and a singer in Mecca at the time, it's like someone who's a singer in Las Vegas. It's not very likely she's an Kulthum type singer. No, I mean a singer. I mean you know, racy type. People drinking and uh, not very Islamic type situation. Anyway, but nevertheless, they remember that she was the Prophet ﷺ said, "Help her." Now, the fact that a woman like Sarah, and Sarah had a relative who fought against Muslims in Badr and was killed by Muslims. So her relative fought against Muslims. She was not a Muslim, and when she was asked by the Prophet ﷺ, she said, "No, I'm not converting." And she had a profession that's, racy. Um, I don't know if she was still in her profession when she went or she had retired because we don't know her age when this events took place. But anyway, but the fact that if Sarah, who had a relative that fought against Muslims in Badr, made that trek and insisted that she's not Muslim and still knew that she would be assisted, the likelihood, if she thought that they're not going to help me if I told them I'm not Muslim, she would have told them I'm a Muslim. That tells me that this was a thing. Sarah is not an isolated incident. That it must have been, and the corroborating evidence we'll see, is that people started going to Medina not just because they wanted to convert, but because for personal gain, because Medina was known as where people are charitable and they're going to help. So if you don't have money, that's where you go. And second, even for women who were experiencing family problems or husbands that they hated, they thought of Medina as a refuge. That this is where you can go and you can change your personal circumstance. Gives you a very different understanding of what the place, and it also allows you to understand why Islam, why becoming a Muslim in the Near East for the next few hundred years was a very fashionable thing, because it was what it was the it was what people saw as the attractive thing, the good thing. You don't spread a message by getting it associated in people's mind with hardship and oppression. You spread a message when people associate that message in their mind with what fulfills them, with what protects them, with what further sanctifies them as human beings. It's a lesson that, I wish modern Muslims would learn. Okay, anyway. So, was you okay? Okay, so now notice what comes right after that. قد كانت لكم أسوة حسنة في إبراهيم والذين معه إذ قالوا لقومهم إنا براء منكم ومما تعبدون من دون الله كفرنا بكم وبدا بيننا وبينكم العداوة والبغضاء أبدا حتى تؤمنوا بالله وحده إلا قول إبراهيم لأبيه لأستغفرن لك وما أملك لك من الله من شيء ربنا عليك توكلنا وإليك أنبنا وإليك المصير. So Allah says you have a good example in Ibrahim and those who were with him when they said to their people, verily we are quit of you and all of you worship instead of God. We deny of the truth of whatever you believe, and between us and you there has arisen enmity and hatred to last until such time as you come to believe in the one God. The only exception was Ibrahim saying to his father, I shall indeed pray for God's forgiveness for you, although I have it not in my power to obtain anything from God on your behalf. In other words, it's up to God whether God to forgive you or not. And Ibrahim and his followers prayed. This is ayah 5. Well, okay. Okay. So then the example that Allah says, Ibrahim and those with him. Why the example of Ibrahim? Especially when we read among the traditions is that when Ibrahim travels with his wife Sarah to Damascus, when he travels with his wife Sarah to Damascus, he tells her, لَيْسَ عَلَى وَجْهِ الْأَرْضِ مَنْ يَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ غَيْرِي وَغَيْرُكَ. There no one who on the face of this earth who worships God other than me and you. And even after they settle in Damascus, the community, Ibrahim's community, takes a long time before it's a substantial community. Remember, what did Ibrahim's community do to Ibrahim? The hostility and enmity got to the point where they plotted to throw Ibrahim in a fire. This point would become clear in a second. But the issue is not just that you have a belief different than mine. The issue is that you have a belief, but you have ill will towards me. You do not accept my belief as having a right to exist. And if you had the opportunity to do so, you would do everything to eradicate this belief. This point will become even clearer as we go on. But why Ibrahim in particular? This point detained me for a while, because in the tafsir they don't really explain to you why Ibrahim. I mean, you could have said Musa, who fought battles, or any of the prophets that actually had substantial amount of followers and more akin to the example of the Prophet Muhammad, But you see, I think this is precisely the point. It is Hatib fell in the trap of the logic of exceptionalism. Hatib thought, I am different, because he actually tells the Prophet that. He tells him, I thought that everyone else, they come from good families. And so if they have relatives in Mecca, they're not worried about their relatives being hurt. But I am different. I come from a marginal family. And so I thought that my family is at risk. That logic of exceptionalism, where you say, well, my circumstances is different. So I can create a special set of rules for myself, is very dangerous. But there is another thing about the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam. It is very easy. It's one thing when people understand the idea that you cannot befriend those who are hostile to Islam and Muslims, those who don't like Islam and Muslims. It's one thing when people understand that when there is a community of Muslims around you to support you. But Allah was telling us about Ibrahim, because as that story, when he tells to Sarah, other than you and I, there's no one else that worships God on the face of this earth. But that's exactly the point. That you still must have the strength to, even if you are standing alone, to be cognizant of the fact that you cannot befriend, you cannot ignore the fact that that you are dealing with people who have every ill intent against your religion and your faith. So even when you feel like, well, I am alone and what difference is it going to make? No, it's a principle. This, subhanAllah, we live in an age where so many Muslims have somehow justified to themselves to befriend Islamophobes. Recently, there was a statement by a group of people against ISNA, because ISNA has an alliance with a well-known Islamophobic organization, and they actually formed sort of a union and formed an alliance with. Does anyone remember the name of the of?
AJC, American Jewish Committee.
I can't see your lips.
AJC.
Huh?
AJC.
AGC.
J.
What is it for?
American Jewish Committee.
Oh, I meant the American Jewish Committee. But also look at what the Emirates is doing with so many Islamophobic organizations. Look at what Saudi is doing. That logic, if you are dealing with a people who do not respect your religion, do not honor your religion, then yes, the relationship cannot be a friendly relationship. And it doesn't matter. So I am sure that at a certain level, the Emirates says, well, Israel is so powerful that what's the point of trying to stand up against these Islamophobic Zionist organizations? You can't beat them, just befriend them. But that's precisely the type of opportunistic logic that Allah cites the example of the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam to combat. It doesn't matter. It's the principle that matters. Okay. Then, so Allah says, this is the example. Now, if you know that there's a difference between someone having, because a lot of Muslims get very confused about this. They come and say, well, my father was not a Muslim. Can I pray for Allah to forgive my father? And then they'll always find Muslims who don't know any better. It tells them, no, it's haram. And they'll cite to them the example of Ibrahim and his father. It's completely different. Ibrahim's father was completely hostile to Ibrahim's belief. It's not that he said, I don't believe, but I respect your right to believe what you want. Ibrahim's father was part of the party. He agreed to trying to kill Ibrahim, burning him alive. So you cannot pray for those who are hostile, for Allah to forgive those who are hostile, who have enmity towards Islam and Muslims. But you can pray for a family member or a loved one who just died not a Muslim. And ultimately, it's up to God to forgive or not. Ultimately, it's entirely in God's jurisdiction. But there's a world of difference between doing dua for someone who just died not a Muslim and doing dua for someone who is hostile, an enemy of Islam and Muslims. The second you can't do. Okay. Now, no. ربنا لا تجعلنا فتنة للذين كفروا واغفر لنا ربنا إنك أنت العزيز الحكيم. لقد كان لكم فيهم أسوة حسنة لمن كان يرجو الله واليوم الآخر ومن يتولى فإن الله هو الغني الحميد. So this is 5 and 6. Make us not, I don't like the translation plaything. Muhammad Asad says, make us not a plaything for those who are bent on denying the truth, and forgive us our sins for our sustainer, for thou alone art almighty, truly wise. In them indeed you have a good example for everyone who looks forward with hope and awe to God and the last day. If any turns away, let him know that God is truly sufficient, self-sufficient, the one to whom all praise is due. Okay, so ربنا لا تجعلنا فتنة للذين كفروا. This is it's not we have to pause at this expression. So right after you are told about those who are hostile to you as Muslims, and the fact that you cannot minimize hostility to your faith in deciding upon your personal relations. Maybe to bring this closer to your mind, look at what follows. So then you have this prayer, right? Prayer that the believers are supposed to utter. رَبَّنَا لَا تَجْعَلْنَا فِتْنَةً. Allah, don't make us a fitna. Don't make us a fitna for those who don't believe. Okay? Now look what follows this. عسى الله أن يجعل بينكم وبين الذين عاديتم منهم مودة والله قدير والله غفور رحيم. So what follows this is that, and it may well be that God will bring about mutual affection between you and your enemies. For God is more all powerful and most forgiving. So, what is the connection between this prayer? Allah, don't make us a fitna for those who don't believe. And then Allah saying to us, it might be, don't forget that it might be that the enemies of today become the friends of tomorrow. What are the ways that you can become a fitna for those who don't believe? Now, a lot of commentaries say, well, the way you become a fitna for those who don't believe is that if the unbelievers or those who are enemies to Islam subjugate you, that might become a fitna to them, because they will think that, well, if their religion was true, we would have never defeated them. So what the commentaries say is that prayer means is that Allah don't allow the unbelievers to become victorious over us, because when they become victorious over us, they're going to think, well, it must be because we've become victorious over the Muslims, that it must be that the religion is not true. And that's what this prayer means. And that's possible, but not the only meaning. You can become a fitna for the unbelievers, yes, by being weak, by having no dignity, by having no principles, by the unbelievers coming to you and finding, if they're insulting your religion, and they find you, laughing along, or without a spine, without identity, without dignity, yes, you very well could become a fitna to them. Because I am sure, in the same way that the Emiratis today are a fitna to the Israelis, because they come and they violate the rights of Muslims, they steal Muslim lands, they help Islamophobes, and they find the Emiratis and Saudis giving them money and praising them and laughing along, and they say, what type of religion is that? That's a joke. So yeah, that is a fitna. But also, remember that the context of Surah Al-Mumtahana, it is Muslims now who are having the upper hand over the Qurayshis. The other way you become a fitna is that in victory you become unjust. And you're in the same way that it is not right to do what Hatib did, but it could have been, but for the presence of the Prophet ﷺ in their midst, it could be that Muslims would start becoming powerful and say, why should we help the destitute who are not Muslims? Why should we help a singer who comes and who even has a brother who fought against us and was killed in the war against us? Get out of here. Why should we help you? That is a fitna. Because what the message that gets across is Muslims are cruel and not humanitarian. Everything that makes a person believe that Muslims are not just could be a fitna. And Allah then reminds us, remember, in the same way Allah has said, idfa billati hiya ahsan, that repel evil with good, so that whoever is your enemy today might become your close ally tomorrow. the same idea is here, that your measure is justice, because this is not a personal matter, and the whole thing is that it has to be stay in the realm of principles, not as Hatib did, personalized the conflict. It's not a personal issue. And because it's the realm of principles, it could very well be that the enemies of today become the friends of tomorrow. How? Well, the how is answered in the ayah right after it. So, لا ينهاكم الله عن الذين لم يقاتلوكم في الدين ولم يخرجوكم من دياركم أن تبروهم وتقسطوا إليهم إن الله يحب المقسطين إنما ينهاكم الله عن الذين قاتلوكم في الدين وأخرجوكم من دياركم وظاهروا على إخراجكم أن تولوهم ومن يتولهم فأولئك هم الظالمون. So Allah comes and says, Allah is not, the point is that Allah is not that God is not forbidding you to deal with friendliness and kindness to those who have not fought, who do not fight you, and who do not have not forced you out of your homes. أن تبروهم وتقسطوا إليهم. تبروهم, to be kind and kind and merciful towards them. And تقسطوا إليهم is to be just towards them. So what Allah makes the intention very clear here, that when Allah is talking about enmity, and what Allah started the surah with, al-mawadda, that you do not have normal friendly relations. Allah is talking about those who are hostile to you, who do not respect your right to be, and those who have ejected you from your homes. So as long as there is transgression and injustice, that transgression and injustice must be addressed. That's again precisely why when you find all these Muslims who say, oh, what the Emirat is doing with Israel, and let's just make, and what Bahrain has done, and what now Sudan has done, and what Morocco has done, we'd love to have, peace is a Quranic imperative, but not as long as Israel is still calling the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria, and annexing Palestinian homes, and refusing to address the historical injustice, and refusing to give Palestinians the right to return. And then you say, oh, well, let bygones be bygones, and let's all just be friends. Surah Al-Mumtahana is as if it's seeing our trajectory and our future. By the way, Surah Al-Mumtahana is also a surah that played a core role in the wars of liberation of Palestine during the Crusades. Because like today, there were Muslim leaders who just wanted to have business relations with the Crusader states, and make money from the Crusader states, were opening business up with Europe. So to have business relations with the Crusader states meant you can trade with Europe and you can make a lot of cash. And there were a lot of rulers that thought, well, that is wonderful for my budget and for my treasury. And I can have bigger palaces, bigger, ships and vessels and so on and so forth. Surah Al-Mumtahana begins the process of sort of refining these moral points. You cannot build an ethical existence upon an injustice. As long as these people are hostile to you, then simply talking about friendly relations and friendly emotions is not acceptable. Okay. So that Allah specifically forbids you from turning it with friendship towards those those who fight against you, وَأَخْرَجُوكُم مِّن دِيَارِكُمْ, and have driven you out of your homelands, وَظَاهَرُوا عَلَى إِخْرَاجِكُمْ, and conspired to deny you your homelands. أولئك فأولئك هم الظالمون, that because they continue to be transgressors, unjust towards you, that's what forecloses the possibility of normal relations or friendly relations. In this context, there are a number of reports around these ayat, and that is when Surah Al-Mumtahana was revealed, let me give you just the example. Asma bint Abi Bakr, her mother came to visit her in Medina, and she was carrying with her gifts to her daughter. And Asma, because her mother was not a believer, thought that she can't accept the gifts and she cannot welcome her mother. And she turned her mother away. Now, it's rather interesting that her mother, in one report at least, in one report, Asma told her mother, I can't let you in until I ask the Prophet. In another report, she turns her away, and then her mother tells her, well, can you please ask the Prophet? Which is very interesting, because you find this a consistent theme that even non-Muslims knew that they would always expect from the Prophet the most beautiful, goodly thing. So anyway, in either case, when the matter comes to the Prophet's attention, the Prophet ﷺ tells Asma, no, this is not what the surah is talking about. Accept the gifts and welcome your mother. When you look into this matter, Asma's mother was not an enemy, was not hostile to Muslims. She was not among the people conspiring to hurt Muslims. And in fact, although herself not a Muslim, she knew very well that the gifts that she was bringing to her daughter were something that will ultimately help and aid Muslims. There are the vagaries sometimes of the riwayat, of the reports. There is a report that who did I write it or maybe I didn't write it. Wait. Uh, there's a report that says I didn't write it, but that Aisha and Asma, their mother. It's a very interesting, weird report. It says Aisha and Asma told the Prophet, "Our mother came, wanting to see us, and she was not a believer, and carrying gifts. Are we allowed to see her and accept her gifts?" But weird thing about this hadith, although it's in Muslim, is Aisha and Asma didn't have the same mother. So I mean, it's one of these. Um, Aisha and Asma their mothers were different. So although the report is in Muslim itself, but anyway, by just an example of a report that you can't accept just because of the historical incongruity. There's another hadith, maybe we'll come to it anyway. Okay, so we have these examples that of people who did not convert to Islam, but had familial relations with Muslims in Medina. Al-Qushayri says that the standard for who Muslims, Qushayri commenting on this verse, said the standard for who Muslims can have friendly relations with. He says the standard is husn al-khulq, who has good moral character. And when further he elaborates, it says, and he considers that those who don't respect the right of Muslims to be Muslims to be contrary to husn al-khulq. That, someone who has good moral character will respect your religion. Ibn Abbas, just for sake of completeness, I should mention this. Ibn Abbas says that these verses were revealed because there were tribes like Ibn Khuza'ah who, it's part of completing the picture, that there were tribes like Ibn Khuza'ah that after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, they could see the writing on the wall. They could see that Mecca's power, Islam was catching on. So that tribes like Ibn Khuza'ah approached the Prophet ﷺ and said to him, okay, we don't want to fight with you and we don't want to fight against you. We would like to make an agreement with you that we would not help anyone against you, but we won't help you either. And the Prophet ﷺ accepted these. And Ibn Abbas says that these ayat are effectively saying, tribes like Ibn Khuza'ah you can have normal friendly relations with, although not Muslim. But those who are still committed to hostility against Muslims are the ones that you can't have normal friendly relations with. I mean, the reason I'm spending all this time on this is because we are living in an age of confusion. When I see, you know, I see people who, I mean, as we saw, people who are part of Zaytuna, and they look at the Islamophobes during the Muslim ban and they say, oh, there's no problem with being friends with Trump and his Islamophobic administration. I mean, how do you get to that level of confusion? When you see ISNA going to bed with a well-known Islamophobic organization, when you see the Emirat and Saudi and the Egyptian government was constantly quoting Fox News, outright Islamophobic, and their authority, their sort of frame of their proof that of what's right and wrong is Fox News. We live in a bizarre age where the most basic message of the Qur'an, the most basic, eludes us. So even something as simple as you cannot befriend those who hate Islam, it needs to be proven, which is mind-blowing. I mean, just mind-blowing. Okay, we're gonna enter a new paragraph, so let's take a 3-minute break. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Okay. So, then we now with verse 10, where Surah Al-Mumtahana addresses the issue of Muslim or women who convert to Islam and come to Medina wanting to join Medina. And we don't know much about Mecca's position as to the women who sought refuge in Medina, except there are what little evidence exists seems to indicate that from Mecca's perspective, that the Treaty of Hudaybiyah precluded that or would not allow Muslims. But Muslims, especially after the revelation of Surah Al-Hudaybiyah, Surah Al-Mumtahana, Muslims said, well, the treaty did not cover female converts, and we cannot return women who come seeking refuge to us if they are converts to Islam. Interestingly, part of what the woman who would seek refuge would be asked, because in Surah Al-Mumtahana, as we said, Mumtahana basically means the examined or the tested, and it's not really an examination as much of an oath. The oath consists of or the examination consists of an oath, and the oath is that you come because you are a convert to Islam, because of the shahadat ashhadu an la ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, not because you are escaping from your husband or because you prefer residing in Medina over residing in Mecca. The fact that the reports say that it would be specified that you're taking an oath that you're not coming to Medina for financial reasons, you're not coming to Medina because of some type of family dispute, you're not coming to Medina because you are attracted to residing in Medina, or you prefer residing in Medina over Mecca, that in fact you are motivated by faith, is further, the reason for people to specify this type of articles is that it must have been that there, in fact, as the report we talked about at the beginning by this woman, Sarah, would seem to indicate that there in Medina had become a point of attraction for people who were not Muslim, but were coming to Medina for reasons other than faith. If they were willing to take the oath that they were in fact sincere converts to Islam, that's the end of the matter. And then they had to be allowed to join Medina, and they would not be returned to Mecca. Obviously, if they would refuse to take the oath, then they would be, in fact, returned to Mecca. But there is a very interesting institution that was attached to this. And as far as I can tell, I have not found a parallel to it anywhere. I mean, we have not seen something like this in any medieval practice that I could find. And that is for these women who came to Medina, who were willing to take the oath, if they were married, they would be treated as if they've instituted a procedure of khula against their husbands. In other words, khula is where a no-cause divorce, where you return the dowry to the husband and you free yourself for no cause. And it is very interesting that, and the sources are and discuss this, if the family of the refuge is a brother or a father, and they come and say, we want to be paid the money we spent on, let's say, raising our daughter or taking care of our sister, that was not covered. But specifically, what was covered is returning the dowry paid to the husbands of these convert women in order, and it's not something that Mecca demanded, but it's something that Muslims initiated. And when you find something like this, it makes me feel that, that as you saw, I mean, it's commanded by the surah itself, that form of, because the surah itself says that as long as you return the dower, so then you may remarry these women, or these women may remarry with a new dowry. But you must return the dowry to the husbands they left behind. Which makes me believe that although women were not specifically addressed in the treaty, it is an, how do I say it, an excess sense of Islamic justice, that it must have been that Allah and the Prophet thought that it would have been reasonable for Quraysh to think that women are covered by the treaty, and that because it is a term not specifically negotiated, in which reasonable divergent interpretations are possible, it is basically Muslims treated this with an excess of justice. If let's say if the treaty would have specifically covered women, and what would then have been, you would imagine, in order for Muslims to say, well, we've changed our mind, but we can't return these women. The most obvious point is that the husbands of these women would say, well, give us our dowry back. If you're going to consider these women de facto divorced, then according to your own procedure of khula, you should return our dowries to us. Mecca didn't even get there, but it seems to me like an excess point of justice. It's, well, since we didn't specifically negotiate this, and since the mistaken belief that women are covered could have been a reasonable, honest mistake, we are going to treat this institution as if these women are being divorced from their husbands through the procedure of khula. Muslims could have simply said the marriage was dissolved and that's the end of it, and the woman would seek refuge and but you pause and you reflect again. If you were in that place in that time, where you could err on the side of non-liability, and you could say, well, there is sufficient ground to say the marriage is just dissolved and that's the end of the matter. And anyway, we're dealing with kuffar, and who cares? But the fact that Muslims didn't treat the matter with that type of casualness, the fact that they took the extra step to say, well, we can't just treat these marriages as simply dissolved, and we will effectively say that there's as if a procedure of khula, so we return. And it's not the women who had the obligation to pay the khula, but the Muslim community bore the obligation of paying the khula. So it became upon the public treasury, the Muslim public treasury, to pay that khula. It is only a position that would be taken by the most ethically conscientious. I mean, I would imagine if it was, it is, completely different from the attitude of treating people just because they're kuffar as having no rights. Because effectively you're saying, well, we can't just consider your marriages divorced. And because we really don't know if you had thought of that term in the terms of the treaty that we negotiated with you. And because it was not specifically addressed, we are going to err on the side of returning your dowries to you in order to buy these women their freedom. I have found no parallel to this in medieval examples of international dealings between one polity or another. And that is also why when Muslims then said, well, this should be reciprocal. If we have Muslim women that apostate and go back to Quraysh and leave their Muslim husbands, you, Mecca, should treat this as a khula as well, and you should pay the dowry. Mecca balked. Mecca said, are you kidding? We're not going to pay dowries for people. Some sources say there were 5 women who apostated and went back to Mecca. Some sources say there were 6. Other sources say there were 7. The likelihood that they were in fact 6. According to my list, al-Hakam, al-Hakam was Abu Sufyan's daughter, apostated and returned. Fatima bint Umayyah was married to Umar ibn al-Khattab, and she apostated and went back to Mecca. Although some reports say that no, she converted, but then when Umar migrated, she refused to migrate, and then eventually apostated. And these probably reports are more correct. There's a woman called Buru' bint Uqba. Little is known about her other than she apostated and went back. Azza bin Abdul Aziz, who also little is known about her. There's a woman, the daughter of Abu Jahl, had converted to Islam, migrated, and then apostated and went back. And a woman called Kulthum bint Jarwal, who was also married to Umar ibn al-Khattab, and some reports also say that she refused to migrate. She converted but refused to migrate and eventually apostated. Other reports say that she did migrate but then apostated and went back. So anyway, for these 6 women, Mecca refused to the idea that this is khula and that they should pay the dowry to their husbands. So per the terms of Surah al-Mumtahana, the dowry then was paid by the Muslim public treasury to their husbands. Which again, you pause and you think of the extent to which there is this communal investment. It's the idea that you find among the sometimes I call them the neocon Muslims, neocon style Muslims, who basically are imitating the Christian neocon movement. The idea that this is your own personal problem, and the community doesn't have responsibility, or the Muslims and their community are not one and the same, is a very alien idea. The example after example we find from the example set by the Prophet ﷺ is the community was completely vested in the affairs of the individual, and the value of the individual is the value of the community, and vice versa. Okay. Now, so this is verse 10 and 11. Let's see if I'm forgetting anything. Yeah. There is a debate in Islamic jurisprudence as to whether this measure of dealing this as a khula and returning the dowry, whether that legislation has permanence beyond the specific events at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So, early authorities, I remember Qatada is among them. Did I write the others? Mujahid and Ata said that the law was only pertinent to the circumstances of the Prophet ﷺ and the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. So, meaning that beyond that, in Islamic law, the Islamic State would not be under an obligation if there are similar circumstances, a treaty, and women come seeking refuge, and they left behind non-Muslim husbands, that then the state would be obligated to return the dowry, because then it would be considered a state of khula. Other jurists disagreed and said, no, it does have permanent validity, and so according to these jurists, then Islamic international law would obligate the state to treat women converting and seeking refuge if a treaty exists as a state of khula, and then would be returning the dowry. Which, if that would be the case, then it would be an oddity of pre-modern Islamic international law, because there's no other. I could not find an example of a similar type of rule in any pre-modern context. The idea that anyway, rather interesting. But verses 10 and 11, it's in the Qur'an itself that specifies that the dowry be... there is an issue, I don't know if I'm getting too technical, but notice, for sake of completion, and because I'm always told don't rush, okay, where is it? Notice 11. وَإِنْ فَاتَكُمْ شَيْءٌ مِنْ أَزْوَاجِكُمْ إِلَى الكُّفَّارِ فَعَاقَبْتُمْ فَآتُوا الَّذِينَ ذَهَبَتْ أَزْوَاجُهُمْ مِثْلَ مَا أَنْفَقُوا. So this is 11, right? And if any of your wives should go over to the deniers of truth, to the kuffar, this is meaning apostate, and you are thus afflicted in turn, then give unto those whose wives have gone away the equivalent of what they have spent, meaning the dowry, and remain conscious of God in whom you believe. The issue here is in the word aqabtum. Aqabtum could mean in this context could mean two possible things. One meaning is what Muhammad Asad shows when he says, and you are thus afflicted in turn. فعاقبتم here would mean, would have the same meaning as ta'aqub, meaning that in the same way that there are women that leave their husbands and come to you as Muslims, now in turn you have women that leave you and go to them as kuffar. And here aqabtum would mean just, it's now your turn to be afflicted. It's your turn to suffer that loss. The other meaning is aqabtu means and you punish, which is not the meaning that Muhammad Asad shows. But if it's so, then it would, then you would read the verse as, so if your wives leave you, go into the kuffar, and you punish, فَآتُوا الَّذِينَ ذَهَبَتْ أَزْوَاجُهُم. What does and you punish mean? And most nearly all commentators who took that meaning said it means, so, and then there is a battle and you earn spoils of war of booty, then give the dowry to those who wives have left them from the spoils of war. So according to the other school, second school, that the husbands who had wives leave them and apostate, they are to be paid when there are spoils of war or from the spoils of war. So it specifies there's where the payment, meaning that the dowry or that is returned to them. Of course, if they didn't pay much of a dowry, like if they paid the dowry that just the Qur'an, for instance, then it's nothing. But we're talking about people like who had, serious dowry amounts, which was not unusual at the time. Then it would come from spoils of war. I think the Muhammad Asad perspective is correct, but the reason I think it's correct is because of the qira'at. One of the qira'as for this word is not fa'aqabtum, but fa'aqabtum. And I think that that's the correct qira'ah. I don't believe that fa'aqabtum is the correct qira'ah. I believe that the correct qira'ah is fa'aq. I know that you are supposed to consider the qira'at all equally valid. But I have a hard time with this one. I think fa'aqabtum, which means, and in turn, you, in the same way that they've lost women who left their religion, you lose women who leave your religion. The same rule applies across the board. I don't know if this is too detailed, but anyway. Is that too detailed? Okay. All right. So now there is a further, this ayah 12, okay, prophet, when believing women come unto you to pledge the allegiance, so they're going to take this shahada and this pledge, right? They're going to swear that they are coming because they are believers, not because for any other reason, then the pledge you take from them, أن لا يشركن ولا يسرقن ولا يزنين ولا يقتلن أولادهم. So the pledge that they're going to take is going to be specific, that they will not ascribe a divinity in any way to aught but God. They will not steal. They will not commit adultery. They will not kill their children. And they would not indulge in slander, falsely devising it out of nothingness. So they're not going to go around, they're not going to where you are throw accusations, you accuse this person of having an affair with this person or doing this or that, including something that oddly enough was done in Meccan society, where you would get a slave, the woman would get the slave pregnant, and a husband, because husbands at the time would marry multiple wives and would travel for years at a time, could be gone for a year, and then when the husband returns home, the woman would tell the husband, this is your son, and the son, or this is your child, although the child was born actually by the slave. So the woman would buy a slave, have the slave get pregnant, give birth, and then sell the slave, and then present the child to her husband. The reason they did that, there were many different reasons. One is that some women didn't want to ruin their figure. So they wanted to say to their husband, look, we're childbearing mothers, but not ruin their figures. There's some poetry about this. There's some women who couldn't bear children, and they did this. There are some women who wanted to they did it because they knew that their husband wanted a boy. And so they would keep doing this, and unfortunately they would keep, selling the slave and her daughter until they get a slave that give birth to a boy. So many commentators say that this issue of slander, the Prophet ﷺ specifically says that you no longer can engage in this type of behavior. This type of dishonesty is not allowed. Okay, so they will not kill their children, and they will not indulge in slander, falsely devising, dishonest schemes, and they are to obey you in as the Prophet of God in any وَلَا يَعْصِينَكَ فِي مَعْرُوفٍ, that and they are to, let's see how he translated this, and they are to, and would not disobey you in anything that you declares to be right, then accept their pledge of allegiance. وَلَا يَعْصِينَكَ فِي مَعْرُوفٍ literally is, they will not disobey you on anything that's good. And there's a woman actually that asks the Prophet, well, wait a minute, what does that mean? I mean, we wouldn't, so what can you give us any detail about this? And the Prophet ﷺ responds, so for instance, you are not allowed to be na'ihat. Na'ihat was, unfortunately, it still exists as a practice in Muslim cultures. In some, especially in non-urban settings, where you have a funeral and you pay respect to the funeral by wailing and heaping dust on your head or ripping your clothes. Some did it out of, paying respect to a mugamala, to be like a form of etiquette, flattery. Yeah. Others would be paid to do it, and both were forbidden. Interestingly, one of the women who went to take a bay'ah, such a bay'ah, and when the Prophet ﷺ told her that you may not engage in this, so she tells him, "Oh, I have a friend who flattered me by wailing in the funeral of my loved one, and I have to reciprocate. So I'm not going to take the bay'ah right now. I'm going to go away, and after I flatter her back, um, I'll come and take the bay'ah." And the Prophet smiles and doesn't say anything. I mean, when you want to understand his personality, that's classic him. Very gentle soul. Um, he's not going to sit there and give lectures and speeches and. Now, one of the women tells the Prophet ﷺ, when he tells her, and in some reports it's actually Hind, Abu Sufyan's wife, when he tells her that you have to, the pledge includes that you will not associate partners with God, that you will not, kill your child, you will not fornicate or commit adultery, so on. She tells him, "You didn't take this oath from men. The oath he took from men was the shahada, and that they would commit to performing jihad if called upon to do jihad." But I was very curious why the specificity in this oath. Why the detail of you should not associate partners with God, you should not steal, you should not kill your children, you should not commit adultery. And after a long, strenuous search, I found reports that answered this question by saying that initially, when they were told, take an oath that you take the shahada and that you are not coming for personal reasons not related to Islam, it turned out that if you of the woman that took such a shahada didn't actually know anything about Islam, didn't know what even there is no God but God meant, they didn't know that you're not allowed to bury your daughters alive, they didn't know that extramarital affairs were not allowed, they didn't know that Islam, they didn't know, they were clean slate about Islam, they came from the desert, which again is further proof that Islam had become, or Medina had become, an independently attractive place, because Muslims have distinguished themselves by their ethics, by their morality, by the respect that they treated human beings with. So even people who were not Muslim and didn't want to become Muslim wanted to go to Medina because they heard the rumors. This is where you can receive charity, be treated well, which is a much needed paradigm change in the way Muslims understand their religion. The reason Mecca folded without resistance, people, is because in those 3 years, the young people in Mecca were rushing to join Islam anyway. And the elders in Mecca knew that there was no point in it. But it wasn't suddenly people woke up and said, whoa, well, idols don't make sense, and no God but God makes a lot of sense. It was the demonstrated ethical, humane practice that they experienced and the reputation that emerged from Medina, so that eventually the name of Medina became Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara, the city of light. When you further look into Islamic history, some of the most biting critique of the Umayyads is that they took away from the moral luster of Medina, which again tells you that, and part of what I mean, this is again, I found this riwayah that when Abu Bakr takes the decision to enter the wars of apostasy, one of the companions tells him, well, if we put upon the budget what the wars of apostasy will require, how is Medina going to continue being as charitable as it was at the time of the Prophet? To me, I stop at that and say, wow, further evidence of the historical phenomena that everything in Surah Al-Mumtahana points out to. So the reason that you get these specifications is that there were plenty of women coming without a clue as to Islam. And you wanted to make sure, and that is why Hind, when the Prophet ﷺ presents her with these same questions, she's mocking them. I mean, she's polite in a way. I mean, we could review Hind's report when Hind is Abu Sufyan's wife, and if you remember, Hind is the woman that reportedly tore out, had Hamza's liver and at least bit it. Didn't eat it, but although she was known as Hind Akilat al-Kubud, but she didn't eat it. She bit it and then spat it out. But when she converts, she sneaks up. She wears a veil because she doesn't want to be recognized. She knows that she's done a horrible thing. Anyway, but the Prophet ﷺ, just from her responses, knew who she is, and but her responses to these questions, she basically, don't commit adultery. And she says, well, would a respectable woman commit adultery? Well, don't steal. Well, I won't steal except, my husband is stingy and, he doesn't give me enough, so I steal from him. And, don't slander Tina Bibuhtan. And I forgot exactly what but again, she gives another one of these responses. And even the response, when she's told and obey God and His Prophet, and said, well, we didn't enter this religion to disobey you. For someone like Hind, who knew what Islam was about, yeah, these sort of smart alecky responses make sense because she has a clue. But when you look at other women who are presented with this, it's like an education to them. Oh, okay, so this is the religion that I'm converting to? So, yeah. All right. Then, the closing of Surah Al-Mumtahana. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تتولوا قوما غضب الله عليهم قد يئسوا من الآخرة كما يأس الكفار من أصحاب القبور. Then we get to the closing, and believers, لا تتولوا, do not take as friends or as allies those who Allah have earned Allah's wrath. And Surah Al-Mumtahana, everything that it tells us about who are those people who have earned Allah's wrath. They who would befriend them are indeed bereft of all hope of a life to come, just as those deniers of truth are bereft of all hope of ever again seeing those who are now in their graves. The reason it makes sense that this Surah Al-Mumtahana closes by this, because it goes back to the theme it started out with. And it's saying, reminding that if those people that bear hostility against Islam and that have committed themselves to be unjust towards Muslims earns God's wrath. And it makes sense that Allah is saying, and if you ally yourselves to them, or if you pretend that this problem doesn't exist, you in turn are like them. But the reason I pause at this is because we get these reports, number of reports, that some reports that say, well, there were fuqara and Muslimin, that there were indigent Muslims who would go to Jews in Medina and sell or communicate information about Muslims to these Jewish communities in return for payment. Other reports said that individuals like Abdullah ibn Amr and Zayd ibn al-Harth had developed close relationships with Jewish individuals in Medina who were known for their hatred and enmity towards Islam. The reason I posit these reports, because they're multiple, come in many different, through many different ways and many reports. Remember that according to the reports that I questioned earlier, that the Jewish tribes in Medina are supposed to have been expelled by this time. So who are those Jews in Medina? And this is not an isolated type of report. We continue to get reports throughout, after the supposed complete expulsion of Jews from Medina, of the continuing existence of Jewish communities in Medina. Which goes back to the point I raised much earlier, that I have very serious doubts about the authenticity of these reports about the complete expulsion of Jewish tribes from Medina. Yes, there were large, every incident of betrayal or treachery must have been addressed by some form of expulsion. But the evidence is that there continued to exist in Medina Jewish communities for even long after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And this goes back again to the change of transmission of the narratives about the complete expulsion of Jews, which, as I go back to what I said about that there are just a lot of red flags about who transmitted these traditions, and and the political motivations behind them. But okay, but aside from this, point about Jewish tribes and so on, which, the historical issue, the closing of Surah Al-Mumtahana makes you actually, it makes you pause. There is for sake of completeness, there is a debate in the tafsir tradition as to whether this ayah is saying that, who is it when it says those who despair, is it saying that those who have earned God's wrath, once they become ashab al-qubur, once they become people in their grave sites, once they've entered their grave sites, they will realize that there's no hope, because once they enter their grave sites, they realize that they didn't believe in God, they earned God's wrath, and now they're in trouble? Or is it saying, as Muhammad Asad translated it, that those who don't believe fundamentally despair of seeing loved ones because they don't believe in an afterlife? And this seems to be the Muhammad Asad's choice in understanding this verse. Deniers of truth are bereft of all hope of ever again seeing those who are now in their graves. I think I tend to agree closer to Muhammad Asad translation, but maybe in a slightly different way. I think that the ending of Surah Al-Mumtahana is more of an existential point. If you are asking yourself, why would you ally yourself with certain people? Why would you develop relations of closeness to a certain people? Well, up to this point, Surah Al-Mumtahina tells us clearly about those who are hostile. And God says, I am not telling you don't be friendly to those who are fair towards you. And I am telling you, you cannot be close to those who are hostile to your religion and hostile to you. But then, after going through the whole issue of who you are accepting a pledge from, who's joining your community, we come to a subtle, tender, if you will, existential point. There are those who you develop a close relations with, warm feelings with, who you end up allying yourself with. If there are people who see the grave as the end, it's the end of all. There is no hope beyond the grave, because the grave is the end of the story. But there are those who see the grave as the beginning of a new chapter. And you cannot go around the reality that this basic existential philosophical issue, is the grave the end or not the end, colors your very attitude towards life and how you deal with life. Your attitudes, your moods, your decisions, your choices. And Allah comes at the very end, and it's as if saying, ponder your relations, and whether these are relations with people who see life as a transition but not the end, or who see life as basically it, because and because you don't need to be hostile to Muslims to earn God's wrath. غضب الله عليهم. You could earn God's wrath simply by not believing in God, even you're not hostile to Muslims. So the crux here is to get us to reflect on those who despair of, see no future for those who are dead and buried. In other words, they see death as the end of everything. And it is like saying to us, of course, your attitudes, your relations to life will be affected by the philosophical, existential attitude of those that you identify with and have a close, intimate relations with. I just want to make sure I didn't forget anything. Okay. So, can we summarize Surah Al-Mumtahana in and it is an intervention at a time, and this is an intervention at a time when things are going the way that Muslims want them to go. And even at the point in which things are looking up, because by now Muslims are aware that actually Treaty of Hudaybiyah was a really good idea. And by now, as we said, Mecca has broken the treaty. And as we know that, in fact, Muslims are getting ready to take military action against Mecca because the treaty was violated. But yet, Muslims are still obligated to follow ethical rules, even at a point where hubris and a sense of power and strength could make you feel, well, we're just dealing with the kuffar, who cares? The Qur'an comes in discerning and says, no, God does not, you never have an excuse to ignore their rights. And you never have an excuse that to be unjust or unfair. And the terms and obligations of the treaty remain binding until the very end. Muslims, till Mecca surrendered, continued to follow, and even when Mecca was defeated, which is really an interesting point, that when Mecca surrendered, Muslims went, and the people who had wives that converted went and joined Mecca who had not yet received the dowry, the khula. And even Mecca had surrendered. Muslims went and said, here's your money. In every other scenario that you would imagine a medieval context, Muslims would have said, oh, come on, Mecca has been defeated, now the treaty is dissolved, let's just forget about this money thing. Why should we pay you? But what blew me away is that Muslims still went, and even after Mecca surrendered, came and said, well, your wife left you, joined us, we never paid you the khula amount, here it is. It's a completely different ethical universe than what you would expect in a medieval context. Okay, that's it. Alhamdulillah. We're done with Surah Al-Mumtahana. What time is it? Oh, we won't have time for a Q&A.
Alhamdulillah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much. This was really incredible, and it really just demonstrates how, now as we've progressed and, we go back to sort of a lot of the basic lessons that we were taught along the way, even when we were in Meccan surahs. And I remember, Surah Abasa is you can't just be good, you have to be beautifully good. What does that look like? And even other lessons that we talked about, who do you associate yourself with, who's in your intimate circle, because these are the people that affect you the most. And it's just so fascinating because, the continuation of the last two surahs plus this one, the impact of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah and the power of, interacting with Muslims in peace and in ethics, and the power of ethics and elevated ethics. So, we see through this example that, people are saying, oh, Islam spread by the sword. Well, no, actually, Islam and even the Medinan reputation spread by ethical conduct, and the power of that, and what a lesson that is for us today, especially when you're talking about, these very clear verses that say don't associate with people who, fight you, take your homes away, hate Islam. And it's as you said, we see all the Muslim leaders across these Muslim countries, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, whatever, all these people who are just in bed with Israel, regardless of what happens in Palestine. And it's as if, do they not know these verses of the Quran? Did they not, teach the Quran at Zaytuna to let people know this is not okay? It's just why is this knowledge so absent in our world? And yet we have very clear examples every single day in the news of all the evil that's happening because of those relationships. But anyway, so it just, just such a lesson in always living by principle and elevated ethics, and the power of spreading that example through peaceful means, through personality, how you act, how you treat others, recognizing rights. It's all stuff that we all understand and know to be beautiful and good, and what attracts people. It all comes back to light, and so, and again, I just think back to, this article that I pointed out at the beginning of, in my introduction with Karen Armstrong. It's what the question is: are there any canonical texts that are misrepresented, and it's like, oh yeah, the Quran is supposed to be a chant. It's poetry. It's something that can only be understood when it's recited and not read. Well, just in this one surah alone, it's like very clear directives about how you should conduct yourself, and how even when you are, as Muslims, successful and on the rise, God is telling you even then you have to be at the height of ethics. And it's just such a beautiful, powerful, timeless lesson. And alhamdulillah, thank you for allowing us this insight into this really important chapter and just the Quran at large, because it's so different than everything else we're learning, as I always say. So alhamdulillah, thank you. I think for the Q&A then, since we I guess we'll see, maybe we can do another combined Q&A like we've been doing, so people have a chance to reflect and think about their questions before they send them in. So we'll see how it goes. Anyway,
Let's see, maybe. I
we'll see
don't
what
know.
the next surah is next week, inshallah.
Well, if people have questions about Surah Al-Mumtahana, if you're online, send them in.
Yeah, just start
And
sending
maybe poll then people, see if they have questions, then we can decide whether next halaqah is Q&A or
them. Okay,
a new surah.
all right, good plan. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful week. And inshallah, we'll see you next Saturday, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.